Our guest tonight, Dr. Chuck Missler. Part of the lengthy attributes that could be ascribed to Dr. Missler is his congressional appointment to the United States Navy Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, where upon graduating with honors, he received a commission in the U.S. Air Force. When he left active duty, he became branch chief of the Department of Guided Missiles at Lowry Air Force Base. Chuck completed a master's degree in engineering at UCLA with additional postgraduate studies in applied mathematics, advanced statistics, and information sciences. He earned a PhD from Louisiana Baptist University in Biblical Studies in 1999. Of course, today, Chuck is CEO of Koinonia House, one of the leading Christian presences on the Internet. Chuck is also the author of over 60 publications in both print and electronic formats, including best-selling books like The Kingdom, Power, and Glory, Learn the Bible in 24 Hours, Cosmic Codes, Hidden Messages from the Edge of Eternity, Prophecy 2020, and my favorite, Alien Encounters, to name a few. In other words, Dr. Missler is eminently qualified to take us where we need to go in this series, and so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the first hour of Raiders Live News Talk Radio tonight, Dr. Chuck Missler. Good evening, Chuck.
It's always fun to be with you, Tom. Thank you.
Hey, and you know, I had to edit down all of your qualifications, otherwise that's all we'd get done in an hour.
Well, I'm not... I don't know what to do with that. I'll leave that alone.
Yeah.
That's all. We call it wood, hay, stubble. There are two walls in my office. One has all my corporate stuff there. It's labeled wood, hay, stubble, and then the ministry stuff's on the other wall, gold, silver, precious stones. So I usually, if we were on a platform, I would been able to go up there and rip those notes out of your hand and throw them over.
Well, except that you have studied to show yourself approved, and we appreciate it. By the way, how's the weather in Idaho tonight?
Kind of cool. They're moving into fall and winter. I just got here from New Zealand, and they're moving from spring into summer. So, if I play my cards right, I can have 2 summer vacations a year.
Well, listen, it's always a pleasure, of course, to visit with you, and we try whenever possible to borrow from your expertise in things like theology, especially when we need guidance with regard to quantum conundrums. You're the man, I think, and because an hour can escape so quickly on radio, I want to get this conversation kick-started right away by mentioning how in the beginning of your chapter for God's Ghostbusters, titled The Boundaries of Our Physical Reality, which I referred to a moment ago, you begin by talking about a, quote, painful blessing. Why don't you get us started tonight by explaining to the listeners what you mean by a painful blessing?
Okay, well, it's interesting to realize that there are blessings that are actually painful. The example I'll use is when you're maybe 5 years old and your parents point out to you there is no Santa Claus. It's time you learned that, of course, and yet the same, it's not fun. If you're an Israeli, up until a few years ago, there was a major segment of their population that were peaceniks, if you will. And I think the good news for the population in Israel is that they woke up to the reality that their enemies don't want peace. And that was painful. It was a painful realization, but essential to really get a realistic grasp on what's going on. And I find the same thing's true as we approach biblical topics and some of these other many topics that we encounter are made complicated because of the presuppositions that we bring to it, and the most dangerous ones are the ones we bring it to it unknowingly. And so when something comes along that punctures an erroneous concept, a delusion, that's often not fun. We let go of our cherished beliefs. It's painful, but essential to go forward. And that's one of the reasons in that chapter I dealt with what I call the boundaries of reality, because it turns out that if we simply get a grasp of what 20th century science and 21st century science has taught us, about the reality, we discover some shocking things. And we tend to think that this physical reality, we reach out and touch the desk or the table and feel solid. We tend to think of the physical reality that we encounter as the real world, in contrast to these conceptual worlds that we get from literature and so forth. Well, it's what's interesting, I think, in fact, essential, even for our biblical studies, let alone addressing some of the esoteric topics that we'll be going into, is to realize that we are actually in a digital simulation. That's why I typically use the Vitruvian, the Da Vinci Vitruvian man symbol as representing man's reach. We put that in the middle of our diagram, and the first excursion we went to was to go to largeness, things that are larger than ourselves, all the way out, and that leads us to a discussion of the universe, the stars, the planets, what have you. And one of the things, the great discovery of 20th century science, is that our universe is finite. And that's a staggering reality, because if it's finite, that also underscores the fact that it had a beginning and it will have an end. And we know from thermodynamics and other studies that the universe is, in fact, moving towards entropy, moving towards randomness, moving towards uniform temperatures. All work is done by difference in temperature. If the universe was infinitely old, things would be at a uniform temperature, but they're not, which means it's not infinitely old. It's actually been winding down over some period of time. So the first realization is that the universe is finite in terms of its largeness. When we turn around and go the other way and start looking at things that are smaller than ourselves, which I collectively call the microcosm, we get even bigger shocks, because we discover that the universe is made up of indivisible units. Quanta, they're called. That leads to the whole area of quantum physics. But the conceptual challenges that brings are just staggering. That's why Boltzmann committed suicide. Some of the early pioneers, as they realized the implications of a limit to smallness, it shook them up. And what I guess I'm getting at is, when we integrate what we have discovered about our physical reality, we discover that it is bounded. It's bounded in smallness and bounded in largeness. So we're suddenly in a definable subset of something larger. Now, the other thing that's occurring as we speak is scientists are discovering that the constants of physics appear to be changing, and we had this neutrino thing come up a few weeks ago and so forth, says the speed of light, traveling faster than the speed of light. That's shaken a lot of people. It shouldn't really, because the real point of all of that is that, let me back up. I'm hitting too many things here. If the constants of physics are changing, if you look at the June issue of Scientific American in 2005, they had a little article on it, and they point out a very profound insight. If the constants of physics are changing, and they apparently are, that implies that our physical reality is a subset of a larger reality. And I'm always attracted to that insight for several reasons. There was an ancient Hebrew sage by the name of Nachmanides, wrote in the 13th century, that concluded from studying the Genesis text that the universe has 10 dimensions, and only 4 of them are knowable. And he concluded that from the Hebrew text. The only reason I make reference to that is if you are reading in current thinking from quantum physics and the rest, we understand the common estimate is that we live in at least 10 dimensions. 4 of them are directly palpable, length, width, the three spatial dimensions we're all familiar with, plus time. The fact that time is a physical property is the other staggering. These insights that I'm just prattling on here, I've discovered are essential if you're really going to understand the biblical record. Many people that stumble reading through Genesis chapter 1 or reading through the Bible stumble because they bring to that topic misconceptions that they've been taught since childhood. And I'm not just talking about evolution. I'm talking about a lot of other basic concepts that science has proved to be false. If we understand that, then suddenly we discover the Bible's anticipated all along. We know, thanks to Dr. Einstein, we live in a 4-dimensional universe. Well, that's what, if you look at Paul's writing in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 18, he lists the four dimensions that we live in. So as the vanguard of science moves, the frontier moves forward, we continually discover that the Bible has anticipated those things. And our failure to perceive that is due to our own blindness or clinging to outmoded concepts that are really anachronisms today. So one of the reasons I indulged in that approach in the chapter 1 of your book there was that I have found that it's useful to sort of clear the deck a little bit and realize that the universe, that the thing that we think of the universe is a subset of something larger. I call the things that are larger than ourselves the macrocosm, and the things smaller than ourselves the microcosm, but we discover both of those are embraced within a boundary, a simulation boundary. It's a digital simulation. The outside that boundary, for lack of a better term, I'll call it the metacosm, and that's the domain where we find angels, that's the domain where we find demons, that's the domain where apparently we encounter UFOs, these strange physical devices they show up on multiple radars, they leave physical evidences behind on the one hand, and yet they violate the physical laws. They go faster than the speed of sound without sonic booms, they make right-angle turns at absurd speeds, and they tend to be too bizarre to accept and yet too underscored evidence to ignore. So the point is that that's a zone, if you will, between the dimensions that we're commonly used to, namely the Euclidean dimensions that we're all been taught in school, the three spatial dimensions, and now thanks to Einstein, we now know time is a physical property, and time varies with mass, acceleration, and gravity. So it's part of the four dimensions that we can directly encounter. But most of the topics that we're probably talking about are those topics that really are transdimensional. That is, they are in this metacosm and have apparently the ability to enter and then retreat from the physical reality that we inhabit, which is a subset of the larger. And that's something that we now know from just a competent perception of physics, but at the same time, it's also that which the Bible has anticipated all along. And we glibly use the term the spiritual world as some kind of fuzzy, larger thing. We don't really grasp the fact that those other 6 dimensions that we find inaccessible to us are the real reality, and we're really almost in the posture of a virtual game or a virtual reality. Virtual people within a virtual reality that has a beginning, has an end, and has a destiny, and it's also the subject of a warfare. And we're both the pawns and the prize in that warfare. So that's a quick attempt to sort of summarize why I took that approach in the initiation of your book on these other forms of what I'll call weirdness.
Well, and I think it's so very important because, we placed your chapter as number 1 in the book because we wanted, before we attempted to explore these manifestations of those realities, to try to get a glimpse into what is the real, the ultra dimensions. What's the bigger picture here? 10 dimensions, 12 dimensions. I don't even know how many dimensions, today quantum physicists are suggesting exist. At least 10, I would think. And that there is that reality that is there, and what we're seeing, whether it's Bigfoot or Loch Ness, or whatever other manifestation we may see, and then people run out with their cameras and they try to get pictures of these various manifestations, and then all of a sudden they're gone. They've taken these sonar, and they go inside Loch Ness or somewhere else, and they get these giant blips on sonar, and they think they're tracking this thing, and then all of a sudden it's gone. Is this, you think, something that is being manifested from this other larger picture that you are drawing for us here in God's Ghostbusters, this other reality?
I think so. Another example that perhaps I'm a little more familiar with, I haven't really studied, Loch Ness or the Bigfoot things, but I have spent some energies and I have some classified background towards the UFO what we generally cluster as a UFO phenomenon. And both Jacques Vallée, the Frenchman, and also J. Allen Hynek, the American, who are arguably the primary pioneers of research in the UFO area, both of them came to the conclusion that the phenomena that they were chasing was not intergalactic, it was interdimensional, and it was also evil. That is, it was deceitful. It attempted to be something it wasn't. And those two qualities are kind of interesting because neither one, to my knowledge, neither one of those were, biblically oriented people or anything like that. And yet this concept that these UFOs are somehow from another galaxy or something, it doesn't come from the data. What is more evident is that they're hyperdimensional. That really answers the question: where are they when you're not seeing them? In other words, we don't find them traveling through space, if you will. We do find them able, apparently, to materialize and dematerialize at strange times, and yet they're not just apparitions or psychiatric kinds of things. They show up on multiple radars simultaneously, and they also have left physical evidence on the ground, radiation and burnt ground and that sort of thing. So they're tangible on the one hand. At the same time, they violate physical laws, right-angle turns and all that sort of thing. In fact, there's 432 examples of formation flying that were studied in a classified program. That's where they concluded that they actually are piloted by sentient beings. And the formation flying evidence, that was the purpose of the study some time ago. So the point is, and understand what I'm talking about here is a very, very small percentage of the UFO reports, because many, many, many of the stuff you hear about or get recorded is nonsense. They're either impressionable or they're, in many cases, deliberate frauds. Part of the challenge in researching that area is to wade through the nonsense and the hoaxes and all of that. But in there you do find serious, solid materials that evidence that something really is going on. And I remember the week that I entered the Naval Academy, happened to be in June of '52. Andrews Air Force Base, and also what was then Washington National, were shut down for several days because of UFOs. It was in the papers, and it was a big splash at the time. That was not nonsense. People were terrified because they could not explain what was going on. It was really going on. It actually averted air traffic at the time and so forth. That was I remember that because it was very vivid. It wasn't somebody reporting something. It was something that was actually going on over an extended number of days there in the Washington area. And so anyway, I've been through enough of these to realize that's something real, but I believe it's hyperdimensional. And I was fascinated that the most competent researchers in that area came to that conclusion from the data. And so, now what does that mean? I don't know. I personally tend to presume that it is linked to a demonic agenda of some kind, but that's an inference on my part. I'm not sure I can surface hard data to support that. That's why I wrote the book on alien with Dr. Eastman. He and I wrote the book on alien encounters. But the fact that we are experiencing what I'll call trans-dimensional traffic of some kind, and I'll use the UFOs as just one flavor of that. That's why I'm not surprised when I read in the literature of encounters of another kind, strange creatures and that sort of thing. I'm not surprised, but clearly there is another dimension, and there are elements of it that are hostile, and the ones that are most scary are the ones that are deceitful. If something's hostile and conspicuously such, there's ways that you can deal with that. The things that are probably the most dangerous are the ones that are deceitful, and I think that can lead to theological issues, that can lead to other forms of deception, and it's interesting to me as I watch through technology how often when we don't understand something, we give it a fancy label to hide the fact we don't really understand something, and that's we find that all through the quantum physics area, and we also find that there's just many places where we really the very fundamental aspects of physics are being challenged because we've jumped to conclusions that may not be correct from way back. But I don't want to prattle down those slides. I might lose your audience here.
Well, you know, but it's interesting. You mentioned watching the advances in science and also in physics and theoretical understanding, and then you look at like the Large Hadron Collider, the CERN Collider, and as you were talking, I was thinking back about last year. You know, when that theoretical physicist that worked for the Hadron Collider talking about how they might create, remember that? Create or discover previously unimagined scientific phenomenon. And he had said that that we might send something through. Now this is kind of interesting because you know, most of what we might understand, at least theoretically, is that there is some other intelligence, and it has the capacity to move in and out of those realities. We've never really thought of ourselves as possessing a technology advanced enough to allow us to do that, but now you had this physicist, I think his name was Sergio Bertolucci, who works for CERN, talking about how we might send something through, or he said something might come through. We might open a gateway.
Sure, and that's one of the things that when you start fooling around in the transhuman area, where these guys are hooking up their own nervous system into supercomputers of different kinds to establish a communication path between our thought processes and some kind of bionic enhancement or whatever. What we need to understand is when you open up a communication channel, that's not half duplex, that's full duplex. That means the other side has an entry into our own consciousness, and that's a gateway that deserves to be guarded very carefully, because an access through that gateway is probably not revocable. It's sort of like birth control. It's not retroactive. In other words, you've got to, if you start fooling around with some of these occult involvements, you're exposing yourself to dangers that you know not of, and it's basically a very dangerous practice.
Now, in your chapter, you also make a comment about metaphors reign where mysteries reside. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that's just that phrase always echoes in my mind when I run into situations where we put an elegant label on something we really don't understand. And often some of these mysteries that when we start peeling the onion, we discover we really don't understand something. I'll use an example, and that is light. Thomson got a Nobel Prize for proving that light was corpuscular. That is, photons are like a stream of particles. And his son, some years later, got a Nobel Prize for proving that they were really wave-like. One of the fundamental conundrums in physics is light, for example. Is it a stream of particles or is it wave-like? And it turns out that it behaves differently depending on whether it's being examined or not. And I know that sounds kind of weird, and that's hard to explain without getting into the two-slit experiment and examples of that. But the point is, even to this day, we don't fully really understand the nature of light, because in some respects it behaves wave-like, in other cases it does not. And to give you an example of how fundamental this is, if you study quantum physics, you know that all the particles have antiparticles. For every particle you've got its inverse, if you will. So if a particle and an antiparticle collide, they mutually annihilate each other and throw off a photon. Great, that's wonderful. But Richard Feynman points out in his Feynman diagrams that a positron can be an electron simply in a time reversal. Well, if you reverse the two particle-antiparticle colliding, being annihilating each other and throwing off a photon, run that backwards. And that implies that light can, in some way create both the particle and antiparticle, and out of that alphabet of elements, you build the whole subatomic world with their quarks and whatever. And so the point is, suddenly it becomes, you begin to realize the reason there is symmetry in the design, the basic physics of atoms and molecules and so forth, is because the way one would create that is from light. When you start examining that process, it echoes Genesis chapter 1. The first declaration of God is let light be. And if the light can then generate the symmetry of particles to create this, what I'll regard sort of as a synthetic environment that's been so elegantly designed as to create the periodic table, to create the peculiar relationships that make life possible, suddenly the whole thing is clear, it's staggering, it's breathtaking, but it's exactly what is laid out biblically in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses. So anyway, I guess I'm off in a labyrinth here. My point being, I guess, is that so often we substitute comfortable metaphors without really peeling the onion to understand the mystery that's behind it. And when we do that, we come right back to fundamentals, and the nature of light undergirds all these things. Einstein went to his death frustrated because he couldn't reconcile. He solved his theory of relativity by going from 3 dimensions to 4, realizing that we live in a 4-dimensional universe, not 3. But he went to his death frustrated because he couldn't resolve the next level. And Kaluza and Klein, some years later, did by simply going to 5 and 6 and 7 dimensions. And so that's how we begin to discover that the elegance of our basic existence is a result of design. And so that phrase of metaphors reign where mysteries right is our inadvertent way of failing to really get at the basics that lie behind the thing.
Somebody told me years ago that a very simplistic way of looking at reality as we understand it is that everything that you can see with your eyes is made on a sound wave frequency. And higher frequencies, such as light, also would occupy those things that are invisible. And thinking about that in terms of what the Bible illustrates to us, I understood it as God is light, angels of light, the kingdom of light, and so on, but that the things that we see with our eyes were spoke into existence. These are sound wave frequencies. I don't know if there's good science behind that, but at the time it made a great deal of sense to me. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to ask you about the subject of random numbers. There was a woman that came by today. She's reading your chapter, and she had some questions about random numbers, and so we'll ask you about that. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Raiders Live News Talk Radio Hour. This is Tom Horn, and we've been talking here with our very special friend, Dr. Chuck Missler of the Koinonia House. Chuck, when we went to the break, I mentioned that my cousin, actually, Jolie, had come by the house earlier today, and I mentioned that we would be doing this show tonight. She said she was reading the book God's Ghostbusters. She was thoroughly enjoying your chapter, but I guess you had overly challenged her capacity to be to quite figure out what you were talking. And actually, she was very sincere and very intrigued and wanted to know. So I told her I will ask Chuck tonight to explain what he's talking about with random numbers.
Okay. Well, there are two concepts in mathematics that we cannot find in the physical universe. One of them is infinity. We can talk about it, we can imagine it, sort of, but we know the universe is not infinitely large, and we're shocked to also discover you can't get smaller than certain limits, what they call the Planck limits. You can't get things that are infinitely small. That was the first shocker, to realize that you cannot find infinity. Okay. The second concept that we always talk about are randomness, random numbers. And but to try to get this across, when I was at the Rand Corporation environment, In 1955, the Rand Corporation is the granddaddy think tank funded by the Air Force way back, and it's the granddaddy of all the think tanks. But anyway, they published a book in 1955 called A Million Random Digits, and I have one. If I showed this to you, you'd laugh at it because you turn the pages. They're little groups of 5 numbers, systematically laid out. That's all it is. It's just random numbers. And many people, the average person picking it up would laugh and say, is this some kind of joke? It's just a book of random numbers. No, it was a mathematical breakthrough at the time because they used the largest, most powerful computers available at that time to make sure that those numbers were not predictable. That is, there was no symmetry, no predictability, no patterns. In other words, what they did, they used supercomputers to wash those numbers to make sure there was no design. In other words, the concept of randomness and the concept of design are antithetical to each other. And it took the best computer science available at the time to pull together a million digits they could be comfortable were clearly random, as close. See, if you're in the field, you'll never speak of, a specialist will never speak of random numbers because he knows they do not exist. He will speak of pseudo-random numbers. Many times in laboratory exercises, and there's many times a technician may have a need to use some random sources. And it turns out they're very elusive because any procedure that you use to obtain that number itself isn't random. And it turns out as you really attack the theoretics of this, random numbers are elusive, and so much so, this has been realized in more recent years, it's led to a whole new branch of mathematics called theory of chaos. And the study of the elusiveness of randomness is a field of study. But the point is, what's so interesting is that we've taught our kids that the universe is the result of random processes. It's all just some kind of big accident, and then we wonder why our kids have no sense of destiny. We've stripped away the fundamental truth that stares at us in every corner that we examine, the evidence of design, which is the opposite of randomness. The idea to ascribe design to randomness is by definition absurdity. And you can take anything, take a bird's feather, take a leaf off a tree, and when you examine it, you discover it's incredibly elegantly designed with all kinds of subsystems and interacting aspects that clearly represent a creative product of an incredible mind. And then we discover not only the leaves and the feathers, but the trees, the bird, everything is designed in a fabric of mutual support. And so the elegance of design confronts us everywhere we go. So the idea of what's so bizarre to me, if my background is in the information sciences, and one of the first things you learn in that area is to realize that noise and information are opposites. You make 2 columns. The one column would be noise, randomness, and so forth, cacophony, so forth. On the other side would be signals. The whole attempt of engineering can be described as trying to improve the signal to noise ratio. Noise and signals are opposite to each other. Design and randomness are opposites to each other. And that's what's so peculiar about confronting the lay world, the layman's world, the main press world, is that they ascribe design to random processes. Anyone that's been in the design team knows that's absurd. It takes skillful coordination to make these things work. Randomness is your enemy. Noise is your enemy if you're trying to design something. So anyway, the point is, that was the thing I was trying to get across, is that as we look at our universe, the evidence of design everywhere is compelling, whether you're talking about the structure of an atom, whether you're talking about the structure of the DNA in the human situation. The DNA is a good example. It's a 3 out of 4 error-correcting code. There's not probably one engineer in 100 that would know how to go about designing an error-correcting code. Error detection is one challenge, but an error correcting code is another level. And we discover the DNA exploits all of these things. And so, the frontier of science, whether it's in microbiology or whether it's in quantum physics or where, is always the frontier is an issue of information sciences, and that shouldn't surprise us because that's one of God's primary titles is the Logos, the Word. And you look at Psalm 19; the first 6 verses are a tour de force of information phrases. And anyway, I didn't mean to prattle here on your show, but the concept of the realization that both infinity and randomness are concepts that are beyond our physical universe. Our physical universe does not give evidence to infinity, and you can't find true randomness. That's really what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. Design is everywhere. It says to the designer. You also talk about the Burnham model of the universe. Why is that useful?
Oh, that's a dandy in my mind because it shows, I believe that most of what we've been taught, even in college, about astronomy is wrong. And because the astronomers have fallen in love with gravity, and the whole idea of black holes and all that sort of thing are really phenomena that are gravity-oriented. Let's back up a second. Robert Burnham, who published the Celestial Almanac, he made an interesting observation. There's a coincidence he takes advantage of to build a model. It turns out the number of inches in a I gotta make sure I don't mess this up here. Let me back up. There's a basic unit in astronomy called Astronomical Unit. It's the distance from the Earth to the Sun. Okay, and the number of inches in a mile is about 63,000, and the number of astronomical units in a light year is almost the same number, about 63,000. That gives us an excuse to, if we're going to try to build a model, not just, well, let's just start with the solar system. If you use that ratio, that would make your sun, in the center of the solar system, about the size of the period of a sentence on a piece of paper. In other words, it's a little less than 1/100th of an inch. If you can visualize a very sharp pencil point making a dot, that would be the sun. The Earth would be, by definition, the model 1 inch away. It would turn out if you take all the planets, and build a model using that scaling, your entire solar system would fall within a 1 meter circle. In other words, roughly it's less than 39 inches in radius. Are you with me so far? Mm-hmm. The nearest star is 4.5 light years away, Alpha Centauri, and it's roughly the size of our sun, and it's 4.5 light years away. So we make it a dot about the same size as our sun, namely about the size of a period on a paper. But according to our model, it's 4.5 light years, which means in our model it's 4.5 miles away. So I want you to picture a dot on your paper right here, and another dot the same size, 4.5 miles away. How much gravity do you think they would feel with each other? Now remember, in Newton's law of universal gravitation, it's the product of the masses divided by the square of the distance between them. So you've got these two tiny dots, less than 1/100th of an inch, separated by 4.5 miles, and you take that 4.5 miles and square it, and you divide that into whatever gravity there might be, and that's obviously, you quickly grasp the fact that gravity is irrelevant. It has no real impact. In contrast to that, if you take the James Clerk Maxwell equations of electromagnetics, you know that they can be 10 with 36 zeros after it, stronger than gravity. In other words, what I'm leading up to, what we've discovered, and the plasma physicists discovered this some time ago, but the astronomers aren't listening to them. The galaxies are not affected by gravity. They're far too big. They are plasmas. It's the fourth state of matter. We know you go from solid to liquid to gas. Most people don't realize there's a fourth state of matter called plasma. When the gas is ionized, that is, takes electrical charges, it behaves differently. It behaves uniquely. And what happened in the history of science is after you had Sir Isaac Newton, his laws of gravity really codified what we understand about the solar system, and Kepler's planetary motion, that was all neat stuff and embraced. Along comes Faraday, and along comes James Clerk Maxwell, who codified the field of electromagnetism. But it turned out that William Thomson, known as Lord Kelvin, very big influence in the British Astronomical Society, he predicted that wireless telegraphy and radio would amount to nothing. And that was one of his peculiar predictions that tainted that world, that strangely enough, for many, many years, they never recovered from. Astronomers generally don't really grasp or deal with the Maxwell equations. Why? Well, first of all, they are the force and the direction and the relationship of electric current and the magnetic field around it is orthogonal. In other words, if you take your right hand, they speak of the right hand rule. If you take your right hand, if your thumb is pointing in the direction of the current, your fingers are wrapping in the direction of the magnetic field around that current. That turns in a plasma, that causes plasmas to behave very non-intuitively. And when you start getting into this, you quickly discover that the galaxies that are spiral galaxies or whatever are electrical in nature, not gravity-driven. And so it turns out there's so much about what we presume about astronomy, the nebular hypothesis, there's a number of things that are still taught in college today that do not pan out mathematically, that are just wrong. And yet the people, it's only probably in the last few decades that the whole plasma implications have become better understood. And so it's hard to do this without diagrams and dealing with dealing with sound bites over the radio. But the point is, as you understand the nature of the universe, that it's really, they're looking the Hadron Collider, all these expensive, extremely expensive explorations. One of the things they're looking for is the so-called dark matter of the universe, the missing matter. They say that 95% of the mass of the universe is missing. Where do they get that? Because they need that mass to try to explain galactic behavior on a basis of gravity. It's not explainable by gravity. It's explainable by its electrical nature. And the 90, and we now know that 99% of the mass of the universe is in the form of plasma. That's, in other words, ionized particles. And so I guess what I'm trying to cut through here for just a brief exchange here is to realize that much of common presumption, even within fields of science, we now are beginning to realize are erroneous. No problem. We need to stand back and look at the data and revise our perspective. But again, metaphors reign where mysteries reside. We deal with the black holes, and some of the people that deal in here are absolutely brilliant people, but they're manipulating elegant mathematical models that are yet to be linked to be confirmed by physical reality. Formulas have domains of validity. A formula isn't necessarily true in all conditions. And we often are applying these things. We discover that the forces and the behavior of say, for example, the planets around the sun behave a different set of rules than the movement of an apparent electron around the nucleus of an atom. And so the point is that some of these concepts have to be very carefully treated when you're applying them into different domains. And so it's amazing to me to discuss, as I really have come up to speed in the plasma world, I'm just stunned because most of what, and by the way, I had astronomy as a hobby for many, many years, and yet I now look back, I'm sort of startled to realize how I've just blind to what was going on in the field of plasmas. And most of that has been done by scientists in the upper regions because they have the auroras and they got into that kind of thing earlier. And so there are some very, very, very fundamental discoveries made in recent years. And what's interesting, by the way, is the plasma guys can recreate in the laboratory the equivalent of the spiral nebulas and so forth that we see in the heavens. Once you begin to understand how plasmas really behave, and they have a bunch of unique behaviors, we see that in the heavens. There's a direct correlation. And so, but again, we're dealing with a different kind of domain than most people think of. That isn't gravity-driven. Gravity is, at those distances, has a very minimal effect. But the astronomers were very slow to really grasp that, because gravity you can sort of deal with intuitively. The Maxwell equations are very non-intuitive until you've really studied them.
Well, what would you say? We're going to run out of time here in about 6 or 7 minutes, and I do want to have you give us an update maybe on your Coeur d'Alene, Idaho conferences coming up. But what would you say that these complex precepts mean to the lay person with regard to spiritual reality or spiritual intelligence, or the domain in which the intelligence exists, or their relationship with God? I mean, in a nutshell, they're reading...
Yeah, I think the main thing that comes home, to me at least, is the realization that you can prove that you are within a digital simulation, and that the rules we've learned and so forth apply to a closed environment that we regard as our universe. That is not infinite. Its bigness is limited, not infinite, and its smallness is limited, meaning it has a texture. There's a larger reality that we are a subset of, and once you realize that, you then also recognize that we are pawns, if you will, in a warfare. And so suddenly all these things that you read about, whether it's in the Bible or wherever else, speaks of the larger reality. And it turns out that our destiny, we awake, and we're in an interval between the miracle of our origin, where did we come from, and we need to understand that to give it some meaning for why are we here, from the miracle of our beginning to the mystery of our destiny. Where are we going? When we pass on, when we engage what we commonly think of as death, is that the end of it? No, that's just the end of our hardware environment. What happens to our software? Call it soul, spirit, whatever. Give it what vocabulary you want. The software has no mass, which means it has no time. So every one of us is eternal, whether we're saved or not. The challenge is what's our destiny within that eternity, and all these things are well addressed and available to us if we recognize that we are pawns in a larger reality, and that larger reality we know a great deal about, because there has been communications brought to us within the subset we're in. And so again, it's hard to wrap this up in just a couple of minutes, but I think
but actually you've done an excellent job. It's actually very faith affirming to realize that, regardless of where we look within physics, science, and even theory, we continue to find, as soon as we open the door, God is standing there, and
he's doing more. And it's even more than that, Tom. As we study the universe and start looking at it mathematically, we discover there are ratios and details that if they were adjusted in less than 1 part in a million, life is impossible. So we not only find out it's been very carefully tuned and it's carefully maintained, but it's also been designed to be discovered. The peculiar mathematics of a solar eclipse, the moon and the sun are exactly the right size and exactly the right distance to permit us seeing the corona, from which we studied spectroscopy, from which we got the whole field of physics, and all it goes, we discover that not only is it designed for our welfare, it's designed to be discovered. And suddenly we realize that we are not only the product of a very, very elegant creator, but one who has a destiny for us. And to me, that changes everything. It's astonishing to me how people can be comfortable or compromise with the idea that, gee, we've got our 70, and that's what we call life, and it has an end. No, it's actually a training ground for something much larger, and we can learn a great deal about that Creator that loved us so much that he chose to enter his creation and prepare a destiny for qualify us for a destiny we could not gain by ourselves. And all of this is, as you start getting into this, it's just so breathtaking that it changes your priority about everything. And I guess I'm out of gas.
I doubt that very seriously. I want to ask you very quickly, before we run out of time, if you're working on anything new now, any new books or projects?
Well, we are. We've formed a think tank called Koinonia Institute, and we now have members of that in over 70 countries around the world. They're taking, they can study on the internet in their own free time, and they can even get graduate credit by doing that because of our relationships we've set up. So that's my first thing. We have our big annual meeting coming up November 4th and 5th in Coeur d'Alene. And we have probably the most astonishing list of speakers. Joseph Farah himself, the founder of WorldNet Daily, was having not only be speaking but having a private dinner. We've got Jerry Corsi, who's going to deal with the eligibility of our of Obama's the office there. He'll deal with that. We've got an outstanding guy that's going to explain to us the future and dangers of transhumanism. A guy by the name of Tom Horn will be joining us.
Uh-oh.
We have Waleed Shabat is going to be giving us his unique perspectives of the cauldron of the Middle East and what's boiling over there, with many surprises, by the way. We've got the most incredible list of speakers that are going to assemble here in Coeur d'Alene, November 4th. Well, it's 3rd, 4th, and 5th, really. It's our annual meeting for the International Think Tank also. And so we hype that on our website, which is khouse.org, or 1-800-KHOUSE-1 on the phone if you want to call in. We usually have, it's all at the Coeur d'Alene Resort, which has a limit of 1,200 people, and it usually gets sold out every year. So that's our, you asked what my big deal is. That's probably the big deal we're looking at right now in terms of, tying the loose ends there. But other than that, we're really, we believe that the next 18 months or so is going to be the most turbulent era of our entire lifetime. It's going to also be probably the biggest opportunity at the same time. So it's an exciting time to really do one's homework.
So if somebody wants to attend the Coeur d'Alene, Idaho conference, it usually sells out every year. You're saying that right now there may still be openings. They could go to khouse.org.
Exactly. Yeah, there's the conference itself, and then there's a couple of options. There's a cruise Sunday morning with the speakers that people want to sign up for. They can do that too. That's an add-on, if you will. And but the main thing is the conference is November 4th and 5th, and I think, as a matter of fact, there's still some early bird pricing. I forget when it expires here, another few days. But if they're interested, they can call right away. I'm sure they'll get space and they get preferred pricing, and then I think it runs another week or so.
All right, and we definitely would encourage them to do that. Chuck, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Well, I appreciate being with you, Tom, anytime, and I know Branson was fun, and I'm sure this is going to be fun again.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing you there in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, here in just a few weeks. So we've been talking to Dr. Chuck Missler, a brilliant theologian, a man that I am humbled and glad to be able to call a friend. You can learn more about his work and institute at khouse.org. And if you need any other information, you can also email me at RaidersNewsUpdate@gmail.com. I'll make sure that I get the information to you right away. Well, we're going to take a short break, and when we get back, we're going to be talking with the CEO of Creation Ministries International, Dr. Gary Bates, on the subject of aliens, UFOs, the occult connection that he describes in the book God's Ghostbusters, as well as his own work. We'll be right back.
Join us again next time, right here on RNN Radio.